Thank you, and so to China and the rapidly rising economies of East Asia. And I'm going to give you a fundamentally Australian perspective on the rise of China in particular. And I recognize that I'm going to overlook the rise of the Japanese system, the remarkable universities like Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, NUS, their meteoric rise through the rankings. And I am going to focus on China, and I'm going to focus on an analysis of China from again, a fundamentally Australian perspective. But I believe that the competitiveness and sustainability of traditional higher education powers, such as Australia and the UK, it is fundamentally tied to the rise of Asia. From my own country, of Australia's point of view, with long-term funding for our universities plagued by a government which increasingly views investment in higher education through the prism of budget repair, debt and deficit, Australian universities are being forced like never before to look to our northern neighbours. And while so much of the traditional HE world's engagement across Asia is driven by that quest to seize market share for the region's seemingly insatiable demand for international education, the longer-term game for our universities is tempered by the single largest investment in higher education, research and innovation witnessed, I think, in the history of our planet. The rise of Asia's universities once again challenges us in Australia to reconsider our place in the world, our identity, which region, which part of the world we belong to, and indeed outside of higher education in terms of our broader economic and national security settings, the broader foreign policy drivers which underpin our government's approach to constructing Australia's national interests. And much of our history is tied to Europe and the UK in particular. Australia has been grappling with its identity, and we've been finding our feet in the Asian century. 30 years ago, when my family emigrated to Australia from the UK, the most widely spoken foreign languages by our migrant communities were Greek and Italian, and today this is Mandarin Chinese, it's Cantonese, it's increasingly Hindi. China is Australia's largest trading partner, our largest source of tourists, and of course, our largest source of international students. And the emergence of populist nationalism in Europe and the US, which we've heard a lot about this morning, so crudely demonstrated by Brexit and the election of the Trump administration, again, it gives even more impetus to the rise of, I think, outside of Australia, a distinctly Asian identity, and with that, I think, the creation of an Asian university bloc. To have the President of the People's Republic of China, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, stand at the World Economic Forum in Davos so soon after the inauguration of the Trump administration and talk about China being the champions of globalization, inclusiveness and openness was really testament to the fascinating times that we live in. For with some exceptions, Asian governments, they are bucking the trend, and they're continuing to invest actual political capital in free trade and connectivity of markets, people, technology, and ideas. By halfway through the next decade, Asia will be the world's foremost trading region, with the lion's share stemming from trade within and between the region. Current figures show that intra-Asian trade accounts for marginally more than trade beyond the region, but by 2020, it is forecast that intra-regional regional trade will be worth almost twice as much of Asia's trade with the rest of the planet. And much of this will be driven by the continued growth of the Asian middle class, with 2/3 of the world's middle class forecast to be Asian by the end of the next decade. Importantly, these raw numbers are also increasingly translating into consumption trends, and the university systems of Australia and the UK continue to be the beneficiaries of that, with the Asian middle class forecast to account for nearly 60% of total global middle class consumption, with 2/3 of this coming from India and China alone. While the rise of Asia's middle class and the rise of Asia's economies could yet be challenged by a series of what I think are complex security challenges, such as the South and East China Seas, the recent Sino-India border standoff, last year's election of the pro-independence-leaning Taiwanese administration, and the deteriorating situation of the Korean Peninsula, I think it's the emergence of pan-Asian institutions that promise a counter to the series of pre- and post-colonial and Cold War legacies, which are the security challenges that we're grappling with. And much of this interdependence will emerge from new institutions, such as the Beijing-led One Belt, One Road, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Initiative, which promises to address the region's astonishing £15 trillion infrastructure deficit and fill the void following Donald Trump's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Although China's role behind these initiatives raises eyebrows in places like New Delhi and Tokyo, the Indian and Japanese governments have responded with their own alternatives to One Belt, One Road through the recent announcement of Narendra Modi and Shinzo Abe's Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, an alternative to One Belt, One Road. Higher education has its own new Pan-Asian Club too, with the April announcement of the Asian Universities Alliance at China's elite Tsinghua University. This new alliance comprises 15 members from across Asia, with representatives from China, Japan, India, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, the UAE, and Myanmar. Curiously, while China's definition of Asia appears to extend all the way to the sands of the Middle East, us Aussies were missing from this new grouping. The optics of the launch event in Beijing for the new alliance were quite telling when it was launched by China's Vice Premier, Politburo member, and Education, Science and Culture El Supremo, Madame Liu Yandong, saying that the alliance was about utilizing, and I quote, Asian wisdom to solve regional and global problems, unquote, and to improve the status and international influence of Asia's higher education system. The birth of this new alliance, alongside other new regional institutions, is in alignment with the directive issued by the Fifth Plenum of the Chinese Communist Party in November 2015, which asserted that China, long denied the right to be heard by other powers, Beijing needs to win global standing by the creation of a distinctive Chinese institutional voice, or 制度性话语权, via a stronger and more assertive posturing in multilateral organizations, and indeed the establishment of new ones, with Beijing firmly at the helm. And this brings me to the heart of my analysis of Asia's rise, which is fundamentally about China, its emergence as an innovation superpower, and what this means for traditional higher education players from countries such as Australia and the UK. Higher education reforms are taking place amid major Chinese government efforts to push upward and outward. Improving Chinese education is central to efforts to use innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship to avoid the middle income trap that Beijing is so desperate to avoid, and ultimately deliver some sustainability to China's otherwise moderating GDP numbers. Beijing's latest 5-year plan, mapping a general outline for China's development through 2020, highlights a series of higher education and research modernization projects, including the integration of industry with vocational and higher education policy, the establishment of world-class universities and disciplines, and I'll get to this in a moment, the acceleration of education digitization and internationalization through initiatives such as One Belt, One Road and the Confucius Institutes, and increasing university management autonomy while reducing red tape. The last of these measures will be essential in lifting the quality of Chinese universities. Institutions remain plagued by an internal administrative bureaucracy that subjects universities to treatment as government service agencies. While the Communist Party will still control presidential appointments through its Marxist-Leninist-style central organization department, and the party committee structure will remain, presidents are likely to lose their vice-ministerial designation, which is imposed by the Ministry of Education, where you'd effectively have Sir David Greenaway and Professor Ian Jacobs as vice ministers of education in their own countries. And institutions will have enhanced freedoms to pursue reforms such as alternative entry pathways for undergraduate students outside of the rigorous and punishing Gaokao university examination system. Crucially, Beijing's measures include specific targets such as increasing even more China's gross tertiary enrollment rates from 36% to 40%. And this will mean that there will be a further 50 million people receiving a university education, with a total of 195 million tertiary enrollments across the system by the end of the next decade. Chinese policymakers do rely on trickle-down higher education policy. If the country's top universities can claw their way into the global elite, so the strategy goes, it will lift the fortunes of the nearly 3,000 other higher education institutions in China. And this strategy is rooted in decades of centrally planned higher education policy. Chairman Mao named 6 national universities in the 1950s, a number that grew to 68 within a decade, and 88 by the time China awoke from the Maoist slumber when it opened its doors to foreign trade and investment in the late 1970s. Beijing went a step further in the 1990s, launching the 211 and 985 schemes that shower funds and attention on 140 institutions, many of which are reporting directly to the central government. Since our strongman leader Xi Jinping took the reins in 2012, the top-down plan has moved ahead with a major strategic overhaul designed to improve efficiency, flexibility, and fairness, with a flagship world-class 2.0 policy designed to construct world-class disciplines and research areas through the provision of special funding to universities previously excluded from central government investment. World Class 2.0 is supposed to replace 211 and 985 with more competitively funded grants on both an institutional and individual disciplinary level, with a longer-term strategy seeing China's system through to the middle of the current century, with an immediate target to see some universities and disciplines reaching the global top level by 2020 and many more reaching this by 2050, with the ultimate aim of turning China into, and I quote, a global powerhouse in higher education by 2050. World Class 2.0 represents a potential seismic shift in the way China's universities are funded and an opportunity to build excellence outside of the elite 985 and 211s. MOE data demonstrates that central funding for 211 and 985s between 2009 and 2013 was at £2.2 billion, compared to just £600 million for all other institutions that receive central government funding, a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. So funding individual disciplines as well as universities opens a path for less elite institutions to obtain extra central resources. With analysts describing mission accomplished for 211 and 985 and heralding the new regime as being about allocating resources more fairly between regions, it is claimed the new policy will ensure graduates from non-elite universities will no longer face labor market discrimination due to not having come from an elite 211 or 985. So China's universities are in transition, and so too is China's innovation and research system. The OECD forecasts that China will become the world's largest single investor in R&D by 2019. So in less than 18 months, China is going to be spending more on R&D than any other nation on Earth, with Beijing already investing nearly 3% of its GDP in research and development. The speed of China's innovation effort will mean that the fruits of this national investment will disrupt the status quo of global innovation and research much sooner than China's focus on higher education, which is set to pay dividends much later throughout the century. This shifting center of gravity across research, innovation, and higher education should prompt us as traditional world players to search for a new partnerships paradigm with Asia. The rise of Asian universities, with their growing focus on excellence and institutional autonomy and more national resources, will eventually mean that the international students paying full fees that we've become so accustomed to, they will eventually dry up. This is why my university is focused on building innovative new partnerships, such as our $1 billion Torch Innovation Precinct, announced last April by our Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang in the Great Hall of the People, that combines our academic excellence and applied research with China's industrial muscle and its capital base, with Chinese government policies designed to foster innovation, entrepreneurship, and the global expansion of its high technology industry base. To be clear, Asian universities, Chinese higher education institutions in particular, and the region more broadly still face massive challenges, and it will likely be some decades before the full effects of the new intra-Asian region are completely felt. Chinese universities are also confronted by increased ideological control at the hands of a politically assertive Chinese Communist Party. Chinese cities continue to choke on smog, and there simply aren't enough places in China's elite higher education institutions to satisfy demand from the nation's tertiary-aged population, aging though it is. This all means that the allure of an international education from countries such as Australia, institutions such as UCL and UNSW, with global reputations for research and teaching excellence, coupled with strong records of welcoming international students at scale and educating them to a very high quality, we will remain well-placed to provide higher education services for Asia's burgeoning middle classes for many years to come. Australia's challenge is to look beyond the fog of protectionist nationalism and pursue our 21st century competitiveness as a player in an intra-Asian paradigm that looks set to define the future of free trade, investment, geopolitics, higher education, and research. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Gordon Redding, University of Hong Kong, University of Newcastle, near you, and IOE. On the question of China, Lucian Pye at Harvard, at MIT, a major China analyst, some time ago, described China as a civilization pretending to be a state. And the structure of it is such that the Chinese Communist Party retains control, and retains control on the basis of its ideology. As you just said, all universities in China are under severe ideological pressure. Part of the mechanism affecting education, as Lucian Pye saw it, was that the party legitimizes its control of China by sponsoring education, and particularly by a massive intake of external technology through the education. This then allows it to be legitimate. But when you look at what is actually going on the ground in the input of education into China from outside, you see a heavy filtering going on, so that open arms welcome the input of technology and science, in inverted commas, but absolutely bars anything to do with the society, i.e. the civilization, which is the legitimizing base for the party. So any university from outside goes in and hits this filter. And we see that last week with the China Quarterly debacle. How does a modern, decent university from abroad reconcile submitting to that filtering while proclaiming that the role of a university is to foster critical thinking and the potential adjustment of a civilization to modernization?
Thank you for the question. I think there's no doubt that China's engagement with international institutions and its engagement with higher education internationally is fundamentally on its terms. And I think that institutions around the world and governments around the world need to be pragmatic about that, and we need to recognize that for what it is. That's not to say that the values which make higher education institutions globally, the great universities around the world, the difference between being a good university and a great university, I think is fundamentally linked to our academic freedom. And the moment that our academic freedom is called into question, then the appeal that each of our institutions have for aspirational members of the Asian middle classes, and indeed anywhere, I think diminishes. And so you need to temper your engagement with China by a recognition that engagement with China will be on its terms, and there are elements to China's policy settings that I think my institution in particular are very comfortable engaging with, others less so. I mean, we have celebrated partnerships with China across a whole range of areas. And I've often said this. In fact, I said it to friends informally from the Chinese consulate last week, and it was during a conversation with someone from the Indian consulate who was at the same taible, and that was as difficult as it would be if any of our academics, for example, wanted to host a lecture by the Taiwanese president, or if the Dalai Lama visited our campus again, as he did 20 years ago, as much grief as that would cause us, and as much as the consulate would ring us up and probably give us a bit of a beating in Chinese media, the moment that we were prepared to withdraw and acquiesce would be the moment that we would surrender the very freedom that makes us so attractive in the first place. And I think that our relationship with China is mature enough to accommodate that. And I may well have egg on my face if the Dalai Lama decides to visit campus next year. But I think you've raised very interesting questions. But I think that our relationship with China is strong enough to endure. And I think that's the same for other universities around the world of our caliber and standing. I think there was a question over here.
Yes. I have wondered that if, leaving aside the relationships between China and the rest of the world, if the internal contradictions of aspects of Chinese higher education, to give just a couple really quick ones, the tremendous difference between the top institutions and the bottom ones, which you mentioned, but I don't think emphasized enough, the closing of the information chain to China these days, much tighter, bureaucracy, which you mentioned, which I'm not sure is solvable given their system, and so on, will make their future as bright and dominating as you seem to think?
I think you've raised, again, really interesting questions. And I mean, I would look to, in the first instance, evidence of China's current performance in global higher education rankings, flawed as they are. And if you look at the release of the Times Higher rankings that came out this week, you had, again, further evidence of China's increased performance. Your question about bureaucracy is interesting, and an example that I often give, not necessarily in a higher education context, but I think it's worth reflecting on nonetheless, and that's that when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, there was a lot of talk about how China might reform state-owned enterprises and how we might see corporate governance move to a series of standards and the transparency that you would expect if you were dealing with a listed company. That hasn't happened. And what you've seen in higher education institutions in China is you've actually seen, you've seen all kinds of edicts from the Ministry of Education and from party committees talking about ideological control and, things that are talking about universities and how they shouldn't be too focused on engaging with foreign literature. But at the same time, that is linked to, unfortunately, the humanities and social sciences area. But in the STEM space, you see this incredible hunger to engage. And a lot of people have said, and especially for an institution like ours, which is commercializing our technology in China, in really large numbers, is what does that mean for intellectual property protection? I think that China's own focus on indigenous innovation is really giving China a huge incentive to protect IP in a way that wasn't there 10 or 15 years ago. And that's a reflection, I think, of a country which is really focused on, Made in China 2025, indigenous innovation strategy, increasing its R&D investment, and with that comes for enhanced IP protections. And I mean, I think it was when Charles Dickens was first publishing his books in the closing decades of the 19th century, you couldn't buy a legitimate copy of Charles Dickens literature in the US because it was being flogged in the same way that you see pirate DVDs in China. But of course, the US's own focus on indigenous innovation led to the creation of modern intellectual property protection as we know it. So it is interesting, and I think that the gaps that you identified in terms of quality between very strong, the elite 985s and 211s and the rest, they're huge challenges. 600 billion pounds versus several billion for the elites. And in talking to provincial governments, they're fundamentally focused on how they can achieve a quantum leap in performance. And but it's as I did emphasize on a number of occasions throughout the presentation, I think China's focus on tech is delivering much faster payback than its focus on higher education. And higher education, I think, will be beyond most of our lifetimes before we see the full effects of China's investment in higher education pay off at scale. But we're living in extremely interesting times. And with that, I think I've indulged you enough, and I'd like to call our next speaker, but thank you very much.